Ever get that feeling like you're seeing yourself through someone else's eyes? Almost like you're looking in a mirror, but the reflection isn't quite you.
Oh, absolutely. That feeling of being observed, judged, maybe.
Yeah.
It's definitely more than just a fleeting moment of self-awareness, right? It can
Mm.
really get into your skin.
Yeah. And for today's deep dive, we're going to explore that very feeling, that sense of doubleness, through the lens of double consciousness.
Right. A super fascinating concept in social philosophy.
And to guide us, we have this incredibly detailed entry on double consciousness from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
A fantastic resource, really lays out the history and the nuances of the concept.
But for folks who aren't super familiar with it, where does this idea, this double consciousness, really originate?
Well, the big name here, the one who really put this on the philosophical map, is W.E.B. Du Bois.
Du Bois, of course, yeah.
Especially his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk. It was Du Bois who used double consciousness to describe the distinct experience of African Americans living in a white-dominated society, a society that often denied them their full humanity and imposed upon them a sense of two-ness, this feeling of being both American and Negro, yet never fully either.
So this double consciousness is about this divided self, this struggle for identity under the pressures of social and racial oppression.
Exactly. And the encyclopedia points out that this isn't just a Du Bois thing. This idea, this concept of a divided consciousness, has roots that go way back, even to the 19th century.
Oh, really? That far back?
Yeah, you see it popping up in those early psychological studies, especially over the North Atlantic, where they were trying to understand stuff like split personality.
Like multiple personalities.
Right, yeah, exactly. Things like that. And at the same time, you have these idealist philosophers, guys like Emerson, and Hegel, the German philosopher, especially in his big book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. They were wrestling with these ideas of self and other recognition, alienation, all this stuff that kind of feeds into what Du Bois would later articulate.
So Du Bois wasn't working in a vacuum. He was drawing from all these different intellectual currents, bringing them together to address this very specific experience of racial duality in America.
Yeah, a really unique blend of social commentary and philosophical insight.
So let's dive right into Du Bois' own words. There's this incredibly powerful passage in The Souls of Black Folk from the chapter of Our Spiritual Strivings that really lays out the core of this concept.
Absolutely. It's like the cornerstone of understanding double consciousness.
And if you're game, maybe we can read that passage and break it down a bit.
Sure, let's do it. It's a bit long, but it's worth it.
Okay, so Du Bois writes, after the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Tut and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world.
Wow, that's powerful.
Just the imagery alone, right?
That veil, it's such a stark metaphor for this barrier, this separation.
Yeah, it immediately highlights this epistemic divide, this inability to see oneself clearly because of the social and racial context.
Right, and then he goes on, it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. It's heartbreaking, to think about that constant feeling of judgment, of being measured against a standard that you could never fully meet.
It's a deeply unsettling experience.
Yeah.
To always feel like you're being watched, evaluated, and found wanting. And then he says, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. That image of being torn apart from within, it's so visceral, so powerful.
It really gets to the heart of the psychological and emotional toll of double consciousness. This constant tension, this feeling of being pulled in two directions at once.
And as the encyclopedia emphasizes, this two-ness isn't just some occasional thing. It's a persistent form of consciousness, a fundamental way of being in the world for African Americans within this very specific historical and social context.
Right. It's not just a fleeting feeling. It's a deep-seated aspect of their lived experience, shaped by the realities of racial prejudice and oppression. It's a sociocultural construct, not something inherent to blackness itself.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the political implications of this. If you're constantly wrestling with this divided sense of self, how does that impact your ability to act in the world, to strive for equality and recognition?
Well, Dubois addresses that directly. He talks about this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge this double self into a better, truer self, but without erasing either the American or the Negro part.
So it's not about assimilation or denial, but about finding a way to reconcile these different facets of identity in a society that often forces you to choose one over the other.
Exactly. It's about achieving a sense of wholeness and integration in a world that constantly tries to fragment and define you.
The encyclopedia also points out something interesting, that Dubois actually touches on this idea of a double life in another chapter in Souls, the one called Of the Faith of the Fathers.
Yeah, faith. Interesting you bring that up. I mean, it doesn't explicitly mention double consciousness.
Yeah.
But it does talk about this internal struggle, this painful self-consciousness that can lead to either pretense or revolt, hypocrisy, or radicalism.
So even if the term isn't there, the concept, the feeling, is already present in Dubois' thinking.
Right. And what's really significant, philosophically speaking, is how that chapter explores the ethical dilemmas that can arise from this divided consciousness. It's not just an internal psychological experience.
Yeah.
It also shapes how people navigate the world and make choices.
So we have Dubois laying out this incredibly powerful and nuanced concept. But as with any big philosophical idea, it's been interpreted in many different ways, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, double consciousness has been a subject of intense debate and discussion among scholars.
And the encyclopedia does a great job of walking us through some of these different interpretations. One of the first they mention is this idea of Americanist romantic longing.
Right, so this interpretation, it kind of connects Dubois back to the 19th century European romantics.
Mm-hmm.
Think, the guys who were all about feelings, intuition, and rebelling against the cold, rational world of the Enlightenment.
Okay, so how does that tie into double consciousness?
Well, the Romantics were often big on this contrast between the spiritual and the material, the transcendent and the mundane.
And Dubois is bringing in the specific spiritual consciousness of African Americans.
Exactly. That's what Bruce, the scholar who put forward this interpretation, argues. He points to how Emerson, that American transcendentalist writer, had actually used the term double consciousness before Dubois.
And Dubois is sort of building on that, but also adding this element of a distinct African-American spirituality rooted in their history, their culture, their experience of oppression.
Right. It's a unique blend of this broader romantic sensibility with the very specific realities of Black life in America.
Makes sense. So then the encyclopedia moves on to these psychological antecedents of the concept. That sounds intriguing.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets really interesting, especially if you're into the history of ideas.
Yeah.
So back in the 19th century, you have doctors and psychologists grappling with this idea of double consciousness, but in a very different context.
What were they looking at?
Well, they were trying to understand stuff like multiple personalities, like the famous case of Mary Reynolds.
I think I've heard of her.
Yeah, she was this woman who seemed to have two distinct personalities, each with its own memories and behaviors. And William James, the philosopher and psychologist.
Yeah, one of Dubois' professors at Harvard, right?
He also talked about similar phenomena, like different levels of consciousness, though he didn't use the exact phrase double consciousness.
So it's like Dubois took this term that was already being used to describe these individual psychological states and applied it to this broader social phenomenon of racial duality.
Right, brilliant, right. He kind of elevated it to a different level of analysis, showing how this sense of internal division could be imposed by society itself, by these structures of racial prejudice and oppression.
And the encyclopedia even mentions that Breuer and Freud, those early psychoanalytic pioneers, used the term double conscience to talk about the splitting of consciousness.
Right. So you see this idea of a fragmented or divided self floating around in different intellectual circles at the time.
Fascinating how ideas kind of travel and get reinterpreted in different contexts.
Right.
So, moving on, we come to colorline Hegelianism.
Ah, yes. Now we're getting into some serious philosophical territory.
For our listeners who might not be super familiar with Hegel, can you give us a little background?
Sure. Hegel was this super influential German philosopher.
Well, he's known for his challenging work.
To say the least, yeah. His writing is notoriously dense and difficult, but his ideas have had a huge impact on philosophy, history, even political thought.
So what's the connection to Dubois and double consciousness?
Well, there's a scholar named Adele, and she argues that Dubois' concept is deeply influenced by Hegel's masterpiece, The Phenomenology of Spirit.
That's the one with the master-slave dialectic, right?
Exactly. And Adele specifically focuses on this section in the book about the unhappy consciousness. It's all about this this feeling of alienation and division within the self.
So the unhappy consciousness is like a philosophical precursor to double consciousness.
That's what Adele argues. She says that Dubois essentially took Hegel's abstract ideas about this internal struggle for recognition and applied them to the concrete reality of racial oppression in America.
So the color line becomes the site of this Hegelian struggle for recognition.
Right, and Adele points to all sorts of evidence for this connection. Dubois studied with some big Hegelian thinkers at Harvard. He spent time in Berlin when Hegel's ideas were super popular. And even the title, The Souls of Black Folk, has these echoes of Hegel's thinking about spirit and folk, or Volk in German.
It's like a transatlantic philosophical dialogue happening here.
Yeah, and Adele argues that Dubois was really smart about adapting these European philosophical ideas to address the specific situation of African Americans.
Okay, so we have this interpretation that sees Du Bois as building on these deep philosophical roots. But then the encyclopedia also presents a deflationist reading, which sounds like a bit of a counterpoint.
Right, this is where some scholars push back a bit on this idea of Du Bois being heavily influenced by guys like Emerson, James, and Hegel.
They think it's overblown.
Yeah, maybe a bit. Like Adolf Reed Jr., he's a prominent social theorist, he argues that double consciousness might be more of a product of its time, the specific historical moment when Du Bois was writing.
So less about these grand philosophical traditions and more about the immediate social and political context.
Exactly. And he also points out that Du Bois himself actually stopped using the term double consciousness after 1903.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which makes you wonder if it was really as central to his thinking as some people have made it out to be.
That's a good point. And Ernest Allen Jr. makes a similar argument, suggesting that Du Bois might have used double consciousness as a strategic move to, appeal to white philanthropists.
Right, he was trying to get funding for his educational programs for the talented 10th.
So he might have emphasizing this idea of distinct Negro ideals to make his case for supporting Black uplift.
Yeah, it's a possibility. And Allen also points out that the whole notion of these separate Negro ideals is kind of vague in Du Bois' work.
So these deflationist readings are basically urging us to be a bit more critical about how we interpret Du Bois and to consider the historical and political context in which he was writing.
Right, they're reminding us that intellectual history is always messy and complex.
Now, the encyclopedia also presents an analytic politico-philosophic reconstruction of double consciousness by Robert Gooding-Williams. What's his take?
Gooding-Williams, he's really trying to unpack the philosophical core of the concept to see how it fits into Du Bois' overall political thought.
Okay, and what does he find?
Well, he argues that double consciousness isn't just a description of an experience. It's also a tool that Du Bois uses to critique things, like the strategies of certain Black leaders.
Like Booker T. Washington, for example.
Exactly. Du Bois was critical of Washington's accommodationist approach to race relations. That whole idea of focusing on vocational training and not rocking the boat too much.
And how does double consciousness come into play here?
Gooding-Williams says that Du Bois saw this kind of approach as reinforcing the very system of white supremacy that creates double consciousness in the first place.
Because it's basically accepting the idea that Black people should be content with a lower social status.
Right. And Gooding-Williams also emphasizes that Du Bois was deeply concerned with this question of second sight.
That idea of seeing yourself through the eyes of the other, the white world.
Exactly. But Gooding-Williams argues that Du Bois saw this second sight as a double-edged sword.
In what way?
Well, on the one hand, it gives Black people this unique perspective, this ability to see the hypocrisy and contradictions of the dominant white society.
Because they're forced to see the world from both sides, from the inside and the outside.
Yeah, but on the other hand, this second sight can also lead to a kind of false self-consciousness.
What does that mean?
It means that because Black people are constantly internalizing these negative white perceptions, they can start to see themselves through those distorted lenses.
So they start to believe the negative stereotypes, the prejudice.
Yeah, and Gooding-Williams says that for Du Bois, overcoming double consciousness requires not just an internal shift in self-perception, but also a change in the external social conditions.
So it's not just about individual Black people changing their mindsets. It's about dismantling the systems of racism that create these distorted perceptions in the first place.
Exactly.
Then we have Rousseauian self-estrangement.
Rousseau, another giant of Western philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that back in nature guy.
Yeah, the one who wrote about the social contract.
Right. So this interpretation, it connects Dubois to Rousseau's ideas about self-love, specifically this concept of amour propre.
Which is?
Well, in Rousseau's thinking, amour propre is this kind of self-love that's all about social comparison.
So it's not about loving yourself for who you are, but about how you measure up to others.
Exactly. And this can lead to all sorts of problems like envy, resentment, and feeling like you're never good enough.
And how does this relate to double consciousness?
Well, Kirkland, the scholar who makes this connection, argues that the color line in America basically exacerbates this amour propre for black people.
So they're constantly being judged and devalued according to these racist standards, which makes them feel like they can never truly measure up.
Exactly. And this creates this profound sense of alienation, this feeling of being a problem, as Dubois famously put it.
It's like they're trapped in this hall of mirrors, constantly being reflected back to themselves in these distorted and demeaning ways.
Right. And Kirkland also emphasizes that double consciousness isn't just about this internalized sense of inferiority. It's also about the strategies that black people develop to navigate this hostile social environment.
Like code switching, maybe, or trying to present a certain image to the white world?
Yeah, exactly. He talks about this duplicitous form of double consciousness where you kind of have to put on a mask to survive.
It's a survival mechanism in a world that doesn't see you for who you truly are. So we've looked at these different philosophical interpretations, but the encyclopedia also talks about how double consciousness has been used and extended by other thinkers, particularly black intellectuals and scholars.
Right. It's a concept that has had a huge impact on black thought and continues to be relevant today.
One of the first people they mention is Cornel West, the philosopher and public intellectual.
Yeah, West takes Du Bois' idea and kind of amplifies it. He talks about a triple crisis of self-consciousness for African Americans.
Triple, not just double.
Yeah, he's saying that black folks are dealing with this complex interplay between their African heritage, their place in American society, and their relationship to European culture, which is even more complicated by the fact that white Americans aren't fully European themselves.
So it's like this multi-layered sense of belonging and unbelonging, of trying to find your place in these different cultural landscapes.
Exactly. And West argues that this creates a unique set of challenges for black identity formation.
Then there's Paul Gilroy, who's known for his work on the Black Atlantic.
Yeah, Gilroy's super interesting. He takes double consciousness and says, look, this isn't just an American thing.
It's a global phenomenon.
Yeah, he sees it as reflecting a shared experience of displacement, enslavement, and oppression that connects black people across the diaspora, particularly in the Americas and Europe.
So it's like a transnational consciousness that emerges from this history of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade.
Exactly. And Gilroy also connects double consciousness to this broader critique of modernity. You know, all the promises of progress and freedom that often exclude or exploit black people.
It's a way of seeing the world from the margins, of questioning the dominant narratives.
Right.
Then we have Paget Henry, who offers a phenomenological view of double consciousness. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. Phenomenology is a philosophical approach that focuses on the study of lived experience, you know, how we experience and make sense of the world.
Okay, so Henry is looking at double consciousness as a kind of lived experience, a way of being in the world.
Exactly. And he makes a distinction between Du Bois' concept and Hegel's. He says that Du Bois is specifically focused on the experience of the black subject, the person of African descent, whose consciousness is shaped by this unique history of racial oppression.
And what about this idea of second sight?
Well, Henry says that for Du Bois, so second sight is initially this kind of imposed self-blindness.
What do you mean?
He means that because black people are forced to see themselves through the eyes of the white other, their self-perception gets distorted.
They internalize the racism, the prejudice.
Yeah, but Henry also talks about the possibility of potentiated second sight, where black people can overcome this distorted vision
By
reclaiming their African heritage, by developing a critical consciousness, by seeing themselves through their own eyes, not just the eyes of the oppressor.
So it's about moving from this imposed self-blindness to a more authentic and empowered vision of oneself.
Exactly. And Henry even connects Du Bois's ideas to Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist and philosopher who wrote Black Skin, White Masks.
Oh yeah, Fanon, his work is incredible.
Yeah, super influential. And Henry sees Fanon as providing a more detailed psychological analysis of how double consciousness actually plays out in the minds of black people.
And then we have Lewis Gordon, who really zeroes in on that famous Du Bois question. How does it feel to be a problem?
Yeah, that's a powerful question, right? Gordon sees it as going right to the heart of the Black experience in America.
Because it exposes the way that Black people are constantly being seen as a problem, as a threat, as something to be controlled or eliminated.
Exactly. And Gordon distinguishes between a negative version of double consciousness, where Black people internalize this problem identity, and an affirmative version where they reject it and develop a critical consciousness of the system that's oppressing them.
So it's about moving from self-doubt to self-affirmation, from feeling like a problem to seeing the real problem, which is racism itself. Okay, so we've seen how double consciousness has been interpreted and expanded upon in all these different ways. But the encyclopedia also points out some problems and critiques of the conception, some areas where it might fall short or need further clarification.
Yeah, there are definitely some important points of contention, as with any complex philosophical concept.
One of the first issues they raise is this seeming contradiction. Du Bois himself writes with such clarity and self-assurance, yet he's saying that all Negroes experience this divided consciousness.
Right, so how can Du Bois be so insightful and articulate if he's supposedly caught in this same web of double consciousness?
Gooding Williams, the philosopher we talked about earlier, he tries to address this by saying that maybe we need to distinguish between Du Bois, the author, and the narrator in Souls.
Right, like maybe the narrator is still struggling with double consciousness, but Du Bois himself has somehow transcended it.
Or maybe he's achieved this potentiated second sight, like Henry was talking about.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Another issue is the scope of double consciousness. Does it apply to all Black people or just certain segments of the Black community?
Yeah, that's a good point. Du Bois sometimes writes as if it's a universal experience for all Negroes. But some scholars, and even some Black folks themselves, have said, wait a minute, that's not my experience at all.
Like Molefiki Tasante, the Afrocentric scholar.
Yeah, Asante has said that he never felt this double consciousness growing up in a strong Black community in the South.
So it's important to remember that Black experiences are diverse, and not everyone feels this sense of doubleness in the same way, or even at all.
Absolutely.
Then there's the question of what exactly Du Bois means by this conflict between American and Negro ideals.
Yeah, he doesn't really spell that out in detail.
So it's hard to know what those ideals are and how they actually clash in the lives of Black people.
Right, and some scholars have argued that this whole idea of two separate sets of ideals might be too simplistic, that Black identity is more complex and fluid than that.
And Darlene Clark-Hine, the historian, she points out that Du Bois' concept is kind of centered on the male experience.
Right, it's focused on this idea of manhood.
Right.
And achieving a unified self.
And she argues that Black women have a different experience, one that's shaped not just by race, but also by gender, by class, by all these other intersecting factors.
Exactly. So it's important to take an intersectional perspective when we're thinking about double consciousness, to recognize that different people experience it in different ways.
And Henry Louis Gates Jr., the literary critic, he raises this interesting question about the value judgment inherent in the concept.
How so?
Well, he says that nowadays we often celebrate cultural multiplicity, having multiple identities and influences.
Right, it's seen as a positive thing.
But Du Bois' double consciousness is all about this painful internal conflict, this feeling of being torn apart.
So Gates is asking, can double consciousness really be a good thing, even if it gives you a unique perspective on the world?
Yeah, it's a provocative question. And finally, the encyclopedia touches on the complexities of mixed-race identity. They point out that while Du Bois was aware of the specific challenges faced by mixed-race individuals, it wasn't really a central focus in his work.
Yeah, Du Bois himself had a mixed racial background, so he was definitely aware of these issues. But in Souls, he's primarily focused on this binary of Negro and American as it was constructed in the Jim Crow era.
So while his concept is super important for understanding race in America, it doesn't necessarily capture the full range of experiences, especially for those who don't fit neatly into that binary.
Right.
Now, the encyclopedia also looks at Du Bois' later writings to see if this idea of double consciousness continues to show up.
Yeah, it's fascinating to trace the evolution of his thought.
So what do they find? Does he keep using the term?
Not really. He mostly drops it after Souls.
Oh, interesting.
But a lot of scholars argue that the underlying concepts, the ideas about seeing yourself through the eyes of the other, the struggle for recognition, the feeling of being a problem, all these things continue to pop up in his later work.
So even if the specific term disappears, the ideas are still there, shaping his analysis.
Exactly. Like in his 1920 essay, The Souls of White Folks, Dubois talks about having this clairvoyance into the minds of white people.
Almost like an inverted second sight.
Yeah, it's like he's saying that because he's been on the receiving end of so much racism and prejudice, he can see through the facade of white supremacy in a way that white folks themselves can't.
That's a powerful idea.
Definitely.
And then in his 1933 essay on being ashamed of oneself, Dubois explores this phenomenon of Black people feeling ashamed of other Black people, particularly those who are poorer or less educated.
Right, and you can see how that connects back to double consciousness, this idea of internalizing the negative judgments of the dominant society and turning them inward on your own community.
It's like a form of self-hatred that's rooted in racism.
Exactly.
And then, in his 1940 autobiography, Dusk of Dawn, Dubois shifts his focus a bit to the double environment of Black Americans.
Right, he talks about how Black people are constantly navigating these two worlds, the white world and the Black world.
And how that creates its own set of pressures and challenges.
Yeah, and he also talks about Negro self-criticism and this lack of faith in Black possibilities, which some scholars see as a continuation of those ideas about internalized racism and false self-consciousness that he explored in Souls.
So even though he's not using the term double consciousness anymore, the core concerns are still there.
Right.
But the encyclopedia also notes that in Dusk of Dawn, Dubois doesn't really talk about this inner two-ness anymore.
Yeah, that language kind of disappears.
So it seems like his thinking was evolving, maybe becoming more nuanced and complex.
Definitely. And he also starts to make these broader historical claims, suggesting that this struggle for self-recognition isn't unique to Black Americans, but has been experienced by many oppressed groups throughout history.
So he's universalizing the experience in a way.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so finally, the encyclopedia looks at how double consciousness has moved beyond the black-white binary, how it's been applied to other contexts and groups.
Right. It's a concept that has resonated with a lot of people who have felt marginalized or othered in some way.
They start by discussing Nelson Maldonado Torres's work in post-continental philosophy. What's his take on double consciousness?
Well, Maldonado Torres is a really interesting thinker. He uses double consciousness to critique the Eurocentrism of Western thought.
Meaning
He's saying that Western philosophy, even when it claims to be universal, often ignores or marginalizes the experiences and perspectives of people outside of Europe and North America.
And he sees double consciousness as a way of exposing this blind spot.
Exactly. He argues that Western thinkers, even guys like Sartre, who was all about freedom and authenticity, still exhibit this double consciousness of European modernity.
In what way?
Well, they're aware of the horrors of colonialism, the exploitation of other cultures, but they don't fully acknowledge how their own thinking is shaped by that history.
So they have this kind of split consciousness, but it's different from the double consciousness that Dubois described.
Right. Maldonado Torres distinguishes between the double consciousness of the normative subject, the person who benefits from the dominant system, and the double consciousness of the damned, those who are oppressed and excluded.
So it's like there are different levels of double consciousness depending on your position in the power structure.
Exactly.
And then we have Linda Martin Alcoff, who introduces this fascinating idea of white double consciousness.
Yeah, that's a really provocative concept. Alcoff is arguing that white people, especially in the contemporary world, are starting to experience their own form of double consciousness.
How so?
Well, she says that with the decline of white hegemony, the idea that white people are automatically in charge, many white folks are starting to feel uncertain about their place in society.
Because they're no longer the unquestioned majority.
Right, and they're also becoming more aware of the history of racism and white supremacy, which makes them see themselves in a new light.
So they're starting to see themselves through the eyes of those who have been historically marginalized by whiteness.
Exactly, and Alcoff says that this can be a positive thing because it can lead to a more critical understanding of race and a willingness to challenge white privilege.
So white double consciousness is like a wake-up call, a chance for white people to deconstruct their own assumptions and become allies in the fight against racism.
Right.
And finally, there's Jose Medina, who talks about kaleidoscopic consciousness.
Yeah, Medina takes the basic idea of double consciousness, this awareness of multiple perspectives, and expands it even further.
He's going beyond the binary.
Exactly. He says that we need to develop this kaleidoscopic consciousness where we're constantly engaging with different viewpoints, challenging our own assumptions, and recognizing the ways that knowledge is shaped by power.
So it's not just about seeing the world from two perspectives, but from as many perspectives as possible.
Right. And Medina says that this is especially important for resisting epistemic injustice, which is basically when someone's knowledge or experience is ignored or devalued because of their identity.
So it's about creating a more inclusive and equitable way of knowing the world.
Exactly.
Wow, this